Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I love asking questions. In fact, I have a friend who has nicknamed me Inquisitive Stephany. And in my vast travels around the world, I have asked a lot of people the following question: who inspires you? And whenever someone answers that question for me, I then follow it up with why. And here's what I've discovered. Very often, there are different answers for who inspires the individuals I've encountered. But I've begun to notice a trend, a theme, when it comes to why certain individuals inspire us. And as I have asked people for the reasons for why certain people inspire them, what I've discovered is it seems generally the people who are inspiring have suffered in some way, or they face some sort of obstacle, or some sort of challenge, or some sort of difficulty. And what sets them apart from those who don't inspire is how they respond to their suffering, to the challenge, to the difficulty. And what I've noticed, this trend, is that it seems inspiring people in the face of obstacles and suffering and difficulty have at least three qualities in common. They put others ahead of themselves, they have perspective, and they do the right thing even when it's hard. They do the right thing even when it's hard. And so what I wanted to do today was look at each of those qualities in more detail and relate them to the very controversial topic of abortion. And in particular, I want to share with you various conversations and encounters I have had with people of all different backgrounds and viewpoints when it comes to abortion, and how I have been able to use those three qualities and show how they align very much with the perspective that I hold, which is the pro-life perspective. When it comes to that first quality, that of putting others ahead of ourselves, I would suggest that regardless of someone's political persuasion, love is universally attractive. It is universally magnetic. And ultimately, that's what putting others ahead of ourselves is. That's what love is. It's willing the other's good. And I would suggest that, again, regardless of our political persuasion, each individual has a battle internally between times where they put others ahead of themselves and times where they don't put others ahead of themselves. I was once debating with a college student in Florida a few years ago, and we were debating on the topic of abortion. And in our conversation, I'll admit, I was thinking to myself, he sounds selfish. Now, perhaps I could identify that so readily because I knew that there were many times I have been selfish. And in fact, I can think of a time recently on one of my frequent flights. I had settled into my seat, and there was one empty seat next to me, and sure enough, that passenger came along to sit down. And as she was coming down the aisle, she was talking with someone else, and it was very clear that they were traveling together. And it was very clear that the person she was with was further at the back of the plane, and this thought entered my head: I should offer my seat. That would be nice. I'm traveling alone. I can take her friend's seat so they can sit next to each other. But then I thought to myself, I don't like sitting near the back of the plane, and I don't feel like getting up. And so I didn't offer my seat. And I have to admit, later that day, I was kind of reflecting on my day, and I regretted that decision of inaction. And I thought that was selfish. And my overarching thought was, if I move, how will this impact me? That's self-interested. Instead of, if I move, how will this impact them? That's other-oriented. So I recognized that weakness within me and that wasn't attractive. The attractive quality is the one that is other-oriented. So I bring that up, taking us now back to my encounter with this college student talking about abortion where he sounded selfish. And I was thinking to myself, even though I have made selfish choices, even though he sounds selfish, I believe deep down we are all drawn to selflessness. How can I draw this out of him? And besides loving questions, I also love stories. And as it should happen, as I was dialoguing with this student, a story came to my mind that I had read about in the news. The year was 2012 that this student and I were talking. And around that time, there had been that Costa Concordia cruise ship accident, where the cruise ship had been steered a little too close to shore near an Italian village and hit ground and sank, and people lost their lives. And so I said to this student that I was dialoguing with, "Do you remember hearing about that on the news?" He said, "Yes." And I said, that made international attention. And I said it drew international attention, not just because it was a major passenger vehicle that had an accident, not just because people died, but there was another element to this story that shocked people around the world. Who remembers what it was? Anyone? The captain left the ship, and that's what the student said to me. He answered my question about this story by saying, well, the captain abandoned ship. Now, apparently, the captain says the ship fell over and he fell into a boat. But the point was, the news had been reporting it this way, and so the student remembered that. So then I said to him, and how did our world respond? Did our world respond by saying, hey, that was a really brilliant choice of that captain? Or did our world respond by saying, how could he have done that? And he said, well, it was the latter. Our world was saddened by that kind of reaction. So then I said, let's contrast that captain with another captain, not of a cruise ship, but of an airplane. And I said to this student, a few years ago, now this was many years ago now, but back in 2012, a few years prior to that, in 2009, there had been a US Airways plane that had taken off from LaGuardia when my country of Canada got in the way. We have these really annoying Canadian geese, and I don't know if they make their way down here, but they certainly made their way to New York, and so there was a whole flock of Canadian geese that were flying around the exact same flight pattern as this US Airways flight. And so I said to this student, you know, as this plane was taking off and these Canadian geese were flying nearby, they got sucked into the engines of the airplane, and it caused immediate engine failure. Do you remember that? I said to this student. He said, yes, I do. I said, the captain of that airplane, Chesley Sullenberger, realized that he needed to make an emergency landing because if he didn't control the landing, the plane was going to crash with the dual engine failure. And he realized he could not get back to LaGuardia. He couldn't get to Teterboro or any of the other surrounding airports. And so he thought, I'm going to try to do a water landing. And he managed to safely land that US Airways plane on the Hudson River in what became known as the Miracle on the Hudson. And I said to the student, when that plane came to a stop and everyone inside would have gone to the nearest exit to get off, that meant the people at the back of the plane would have gone to the back exit. But one of the first people to get to the back door didn't realize that the tail of the airplane was tucked in the water. So when they whipped that door open, the Hudson River starts flooding into this airplane. So I said to the student, now everyone is getting away from the back of the plane, and they're escaping out the middle doors and the front doors, and they're getting off, except for one person, Captain Chesley Sullenberger. As everyone's getting off and away from the back, he's staying on and walking towards the back. And as water was filling the cabin about to waist level, he walked the aisle not just once, but twice to make sure no one was left on the plane. And he was the last person to get off. What did our world say about him? I asked this student, and he said, a hero. Correct, I said. Why? And he said, well, because he had dependent passengers and he cared for them. He prioritized their need. He put them ahead of himself. And I said, do you think that's an example we should follow? He said, yes. And so I knew by his reaction to that story that he shared the view I have, that even if we sometimes fail in being other-oriented, we know that that's how we ought to be, and that's the example to follow. And so once we can establish that, I then brought it back to the topic of abortion that we were debating. And I said, if you agree that it was correct for the pilot to put the passengers ahead of himself, to prioritize the needs of his dependents, then wouldn't it follow that when it comes to the topic of abortion and an unplanned pregnancy, that a pregnant woman ought to prioritize the needs of her dependent, her preborn child, much like a passenger on the airplane who's in a vulnerable position and needs someone who's more skilled and older and capable of helping them to help them out. Now, some people respond by saying, well, wait, there's a big difference there. You're comparing apples to oranges. The people getting off of the airplane, those passengers were human beings. Embryos and fetuses aren't, so you can't make that comparison. And I would suggest that that comparison is valid or invalid, depending on, indeed, whether embryos and fetuses are human beings like the passengers on the airplane. And so in my work, I often wrestle with that question in conversations with people, trying to discern, when does life begin? And a good question, because remembering I love questions, a good question that I'll often ask people is this: do you believe in human rights? And I can tell you, I have asked that question around the world, and consistently I get one answer: yes. And if someone believes in human rights, I then like to say, okay, well, what about this human's rights in the case of this 7-week embryo? Now, sometimes people will look at an image like that and say, that's not a human. And if that's someone's reaction, then in conversation, I think rather than preaching at an individual, a good strategy to take is to just ask a question. And the question I like to ask is, what are her parents? Is the pregnant woman human? Is her partner human? If yes, wouldn't it logically follow that their offspring must be of the same species? So then someone might object and say, well, even if biologically that's human, it's not alive. Well, I found myself in a conversation with another college student a few years ago, and I asked him what he thought about abortion. He said, I'm pro-choice. I said, why are you pro-choice? And he said, well, because the fetus isn't alive. And so I just asked another question. If the fetus isn't alive, why do you need to do an abortion? And he stopped and he looked at me and he said, I'm going to talk to you. I never thought of it that way. And so we spent about 30 minutes engaging in a friendly, civil dialogue as a result of a question. If someone objects to the idea that the embryo is alive, I think another good question to ask is this: is the embryo growing? At moment of fertilization, when you have a one-celled embryo, is that one cell growing into 2? And are those 2 growing into 4 and 8 and 16 and so forth? And if yes, wouldn't it follow by virtue of the embryo's growth, the embryo must be living? And if the embryo has human parents, wouldn't it follow by virtue of that that the embryo must be human? And if we believe in human rights, then wouldn't it follow what we know to be a living human has the same human rights as you or me? Now, someone might object at that point and say, but it's just a fetus or it's just an embryo. And so I think a good question to ask that I've asked many people is this: what kind of fetus? If you think about that term for a moment, fetus, that's not species specific. So other species have fetuses. Dogs have fetuses, dolphins have fetuses, and humans have fetuses. So the word fetus doesn't so much tell us what something is, but tells us how old something is. So again, with my love of questions, I'll often ask people, when a fetus is born to human parents and is in the arms of the mother, what do we now call the fetus at that moment? And people will say, well, a baby. And then when the baby turns 2, what do we call the baby? I'll ask. And toddler is what people say. And then when the toddler turns 13, what do we call the toddler? I was once giving a talk, an elderly woman piped up, impossible. That's what we call that individual. And then when impossible turns 21, what do we call impossible? Even more impossible, right? So the point is that we humans have words to refer to age ranges within our species. And so the words adult or teenager, toddler, baby, fetus, and embryo simply tell us how old an entity is, not what an entity is. If we want to know what that entity is, we have to ask, what are the parents? Now, when it comes to the abortion debate, one thing that I have found that provokes a lot of conversation is defining the exact moment the fetus or the embryo came to be. And a lot of times we, as a culture, will resist the idea that when debating abortion, that life would begin at fertilization. And so what I'd like to suggest is that if we weren't talking about abortion, we as a society would more readily accept that life begins at fertilization. In fact, we already do. And a good question to consider involves the following. Imagine someone is not pregnant with an unwanted pregnancy. Imagine they're trying to achieve a pregnancy. They desperately want to be pregnant, but they're struggling with infertility. So imagine this person goes to an infertility specialist, and that physician recommends in vitro fertilization, or IVF, where an egg will be fertilized by a sperm in a petri dish in a lab. Now, setting aside the ethics of that, which could be a whole other talk at Google, setting aside the ethics of that, imagine the individual then goes to an IVF specialist. Have we as a society ever heard someone who's in the business of making life, someone who's an IVF specialist, have we ever heard them say, I just don't know when life begins? If you think about it, when someone is in the business of making life, We never claim to not know when it begins. We know exactly when it begins. The one moment that the IVF specialist is trying to replicate in the lab is the moment of fertilization. The IVF specialist is not happy with just a sperm sample. They're not happy with eggs harvested by perhaps a student in debt trying to, get $10,000 or $20,000 for such a procedure. They're not satisfied with just the eggs or just the sperm. The one moment they're trying to create in the lab is not, 3 weeks where you have a heartbeat or 6 weeks where you have brain waves or a 9-month gestated fetus. The one moment the IVF specialist is trying to create in the lab is the moment of fertilization, which I think tells us we do know when life begins. We know it begins there, particularly when we think about other species, a little less controversial than our own. We never hear horse breeders say, I just don't know how to breed a horse. I don't know when a horse becomes a horse, or, someone who's, breeding dogs, or a veterinarian in general saying, I don't know when a dog becomes a dog. With other species, we have great clarity. So why with our own species? When it comes to abortion, do we claim to not know when life begins, or we claim that it's confusing? When with these other species or this other topic like IVF, we have great clarity, and we know that moment to be fertilization. When it comes to the debate about abortion, what I have found in debating people formally and informally all over the world is that it's less of a scientific debate and more of a philosophical one. Less a question of when does life begin, because really we know the answer to that, fertilization, but more a question about personhood, which is not really a scientific discussion, but a philosophical one. And there's a whole school of thought by philosopher Peter Singer from Princeton University, who argues abortion is justified, and he even argues some infanticide would be justified. His school of thought comes from the perspective of a definition of personhood that would exclude preborn and some born children. And he would say a person is someone who is rational, conscious, and self-aware. And so I have encountered people, and perhaps some in the room today, some listening in, who would argue that even if biologically the embryo and the fetus are human, that philosophically they're not persons, and that's why we could justify abortion. That's why we wouldn't have to protect embryos and fetuses the way it was good for Captain Sullenberger to protect the passengers on the airplane, because they're people, but embryos and fetuses aren't. So then the question we have to wrestle with is, what is the right definition of a person? Is a person someone who's rational, conscious, and self-aware, so that if you're not those things, you're not a person? Well, what I like to do is ask the question, why isn't, let's say, a one-celled human embryo at fertilization, why isn't that embryo rational, conscious, or self-aware? I think we know the answer to that is, well, the embryo is lacking the organ necessary to be rational, conscious, and self-aware, and that's the brain. So then if we step back for a moment and say, well, why doesn't the embryo at fertilization have a brain? We know the answer to that, well, the embryo hasn't had time to develop the brain. And time is reflected in our age. So the one-celled human embryo, yes, isn't rational, conscious, or self-aware in that moment, but ultimately isn't able to do those things or be that way because of how old she is. Now let's contrast that with, let's say, an amoeba. An amoeba is not rational, conscious, or self-aware. Why? Well, because the amoeba doesn't have a brain. Well, why doesn't the amoeba have a brain? Not because it hasn't developed it yet, but because it's not within its nature to develop a brain. Because it's not within its nature to be a thinking thing. So in other words, an amoeba is not rational, conscious, or self-aware because of what it is, versus a human embryo who is not rational, conscious, or self-aware because of how old she is. So then that brings me back to the question about human rights. Who gets human rights? Isn't the necessary criteria simply being human? If we were talking, for example, about women's rights, the necessary criteria for getting the right would be being a woman. If we were to talk about children's rights, the necessary criteria would be being a child. So when we talk about human rights, the necessary criteria simply is being human, not being human in a certain age. And so the question is, should personhood be grounded in how old we are, or should personhood be grounded in what we are? Well, to answer that question, I find it helpful to go to the United Nations. The United Nations has a number of different documents on human rights. And as I have read these, I've been astounded by several things that have stood out to me. The first is that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that is a document by the United Nations, it very clearly says all members of the human family have the right to life. So in other words, to get the right to life, all that matters is that you're a member of the human family. But that document does reference persons. And it references persons in Article 6. And in Article 6 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says everyone has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Well, let's define our terms. Who's everyone? Earlier in the document, in the preamble, everyone's defined as all members of the human family. So this document is essentially declaring if you're a member of the human family, you should automatically be considered a person. Now, to understand why the UN would say that, I think we need to put that document into context and understand the history of how it came to be. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in the late 1940s. Of course, we know in the early 1940s we had the Holocaust, where what happened? Some humans were deprived of personhood status based on some feature about them, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation. And so the UN comes up with this document to say, no, the one thing we all have in common is our human nature. And to ensure that we don't repeat the injustices of the past, it codifies, it puts in writing this idea that if you're a member of the human family, you ought to automatically be considered a person, and you should not be deprived of your personhood rights based on some quality like ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation. And in the same way, if that's true, then we ought to say the same thing about what we know to be a human embryo and a human fetus. The quality of age shouldn't be the basis for which someone has personhood status. And therefore, they ought to be considered persons according to Article 6 by virtue of being human, not by virtue of being a certain age that enables them, as a result of their age, to be rational, conscious, and self-aware in that moment. Their humanity is what is consistent as their age and therefore abilities change. If you think about the question, when do we become persons, I think what's helpful is to look at the timeline from the moment of fertilization to the moment of birth. And if we draw the line anywhere after fertilization, we're ultimately basing it based on a developmental stage or based on an age, which would fly in the face of human rights doctrines, which aren't to acknowledge human rights based on abilities or age, but instead acknowledge human rights based on being human. And we know at the moment of fertilization, the one-celled embryo has all the genetic material distinguishing her from the mother and the father, and from that point forward, you're going to change your appearance, you're going to change your abilities, you're going to change your age, but your human identity distinguishing you from everyone else is going to be what remains the same. As I have dialogued with a lot of people over the years, not only have I found the question of personhood being raised in conversation, but I have also found the question of the dependency of the preborn child being used as grounds to justify abortion, where some people will say, look, if someone has an infant and they don't want the infant, any of us in the room are capable of caring for the infant. But if someone doesn't want their fetus, none of us in the room are capable of caring for the fetus. Therefore, a woman should have a right to have an abortion. When I hear that argument, what crosses my mind is, does the greater dependency of the fetus make the mother less responsible or more responsible? Well, I found myself in conversation a few years ago with a different student, and this young woman said to me, look, if you have a baby in one hand and a fetus in the other hand, you obviously pick the baby. And I thought to myself for a moment about babies versus fetuses. As I just said a moment ago, if there was a baby in this room napping, we could all leave and come back and the baby would be fine. But if there was a fetus left out on the podium here and we all leave and come back, the fetus is going to be dead. So I thought, in a sense, babies are stronger and fetuses are weaker in relation to each other. So I thought what this student actually said to me, although she didn't verbalize it, was this. If you have a strong person in one hand and you have a weaker person in the other hand, you obviously pick the stronger person. And when I kind of translated in my mind what she'd said to that, I thought to myself, you know, civil societies actually do just the opposite. We tend to prioritize weaker people rather than stronger people. Again, the captain prioritizes the passengers, or ought to, and so forth. And so I thought to myself, how do I communicate that I think civil societies actually would prioritize weaker people ahead of stronger people? And as it should happen, a story came to my mind. And again, as I said, I love telling stories. And the story that came to my mind relates to this. And so I said to this student, what you just said about babies versus fetuses reminds me of a picture my friend posted on Facebook. And I said it was a picture of a river. And in the middle of the river was something slightly curvy sticking up. And in reality, it was the kind of picture that I would keep swiping away if it hadn't been for the caption. And the caption my friend posted with this picture was this: "My husband is a hero." And then my friend went on to explain why, as I then explained to this student. My friend wrote, "My husband is a paramedic, and at midnight he was called to the scene of a car accident. A woman had been driving down the road. She lost control of her vehicle, and as it spun out of control, it landed in a nearby river. When my friend's husband got to the scene, he saw that that woman driver was sitting on the roof of her sinking car, holding her 10-month-old baby in her arms. My friend's husband jumps in the water, swims towards the car, and then realizes he can only take one person at a time to shore. I looked at the student I was dialoguing with, and I asked her a question. Who do you think he picked first? Obviously, she knew the answer. Well, the baby. Correct, I said. Why? If you had to explain the reasoning why he picked the baby over the mom to take first, what would it be? She said, well, obviously, because if he picked the mom first, then by the time he got back to the car, the baby could have rolled in the water and drowned. Correct, I said. So would you say it's fair to summarize your response to this story by acknowledging that you believe when you have a strong person in one hand, like the mom, and a weaker person in the other hand, like the baby, that we ought to prioritize the needs of weaker people? She said, of course. And then I brought it back to her original point about babies versus fetuses. And I said anyone could care for a baby, and a baby could be left alone for a while. But only one person can care for a fetus and cannot be left alone. So in a sense, the baby is stronger, like the mom in the story, whereas the fetus is weaker, like the infant in the mom's arms. And since you believe that we should prioritize weaker and more vulnerable people ahead of stronger people, then shouldn't we actually prioritize the needs of the preborn child? That point was something that was emphasized very clearly in a different encounter that I had through what someone shared with me. I was once at an exhibit that was looking at parallels between historical injustices and present-day injustices. One of the parallels being the Rwandan genocide and abortion. The argument being that at the time the Tutsis were slaughtered, they weren't deemed to be equal to the Hutu extremists, but rather inferior. And because they were deemed to be inferior, the dehumanizing actions were justified. The parallel then being that someone generally who supports abortion does not say, I think embryos and fetuses are equal to us and I want to kill. Not at all. But instead deem the embryo and fetus to be inferior and therefore rationalizes actions which would take away that human's rights because they don't consider them equal. The argument then being, if we were wrong in the past about dehumanizing one group of humans, could we be wrong in the present about dehumanizing another group of humans? So one of the signs at this exhibit that I was standing with was this one. And a woman came past and stopped and began to speak with me. And she told me that she was from Rwanda. And she told me that most of her family had been killed in the genocide from the mid-90s. And I will admit, I became very self-conscious standing representing this sign, because I began to wonder if perhaps this woman would be offended by the comparison that I was making. But instead of assuming and wondering, I thought the best thing I can do is seek to understand and ask her a question. And so I looked at this woman and I said, given all you have told me about the brutality that your family members were victims of, what you just barely escaped by fleeing the country before things got really bad, how do you feel, I said, about this comparison I'm making? And she stepped back and she moved her gaze really from me. She hadn't really looked that closely at the picture. And then she just stood in silence for about 20 seconds as she looked at this poster. And then finally, she pointed to the picture of the aborted child, and she said, "That's worse. Because at least my family could try to run away." This woman recognized the greater a human's vulnerability, the greater another's responsibility towards that individual. So if we think about that first quality that I have identified, that inspiring people seem to have, that people I've dialogued with have shared with me, it is the idea that we ought to put others ahead of ourselves. Even when we've failed, we know deep down that that's something to aspire towards. And it's clear that the human embryo and fetus are an other, just like the passengers in the airplane. The next point that I wanted to address today is the second quality I have found in inspiring people, which is that they have perspective. One of my favorite authors is Dr. Viktor Frankl, who has written the book Man's Search for Meaning. I love books, and I love gifting books to other people. And Man's Search for Meaning is probably the leading book that I have given to a lot of people. The other one would be Essentialism by Greg Cannown, which is a phenomenal book. But not what I'm here to talk about right now. But Man's Search for Meaning I've given away to so many people. And this book was written by a man who was a Holocaust survivor and a psychiatrist. And so Man's Search for Meaning is really a two-part book. The first part is about his experiences in the concentration camps. And the second part of his book is his theories in psychology. And one of the points that he makes in his book is the following. He said that he observed, both as a prisoner and as a psychiatrist, who in a sense, as a prisoner, was studying human behavior as he was being victimized in the concentration camps. One of the things he observed is that he would have expected all of the guards to be cruel, and most of them were. But he said every now and then, surprisingly, amidst all the cruel guards, there was someone who was kind. And then he said, amongst the prisoners, there were some who, when treated like animals, became like animals and were cruel to their fellow prisoners. But there were others, he said, regardless of how brutally they were treated, maintained their humanity, and in their starving state would save morsels of food, not for themselves, but for a fellow prisoner. And when Dr. Frankl makes this observation, it draws him to this conclusion. Someone can have a similar experience, but still choose a different response to the experience. And he says the last of the human freedoms that can never be taken from us is the freedom to choose how to respond to the situation that we're in. That is what perspective is. Inspiring people who have perspective can be in a horrible circumstance, in a sense, beyond their control. But they recognize what is still within their control is their response to that circumstance, is their attitude. And Dr. Frankl has come up with a mathematical equation that explains the power of perspective. Because in the concentration camps, he saw a lot of suffering. Suffering that was so bad that some people sought to commit suicide because they despaired. And Dr. Frankl said early on in his time at the concentration camps, he decided he would never kill himself. Moreover, would he not commit suicide, but he was going to try to dissuade his fellow prisoners from doing that. And he discovered the way to try to convince them not to despair was to help them find meaning. And so his mathematical equation was this: D equals S minus M. Despair is suffering without meaning. He recognized in the present circumstances, removing the suffering was near impossible. But he could decrease despair to the extent that he increased meaning. And Dr. Frankl, years after coming out of the concentration camps, cites an example where this equation, in a sense, was brought to life with a young teenager he learned about in Texas who had become a quadriplegic. A lot of times when people are asked, imagine if you were suddenly paralyzed, would you want to keep living? And when we're not in that state, we think, no, I wouldn't. Well, Dr. Frankl cites an example of someone who found herself Not being asked that question in a hypothetical, but that was reality. She became quadriplegic. She would spend her days watching the news, reading the news. And whenever she came across a story of someone who was going through a very difficult time, of someone who was suffering in some way, she would ask an assistant to bring a stick and place it in her mouth. She would then use that stick, bend over to press keys on a keyboard so she could write letters of encouragement to the people she'd read about in the news. And Dr. Frankl said her life is filled with an abundant sense of meaning. We decrease despair in the presence of suffering to the extent we increase meaning. That's what I mean by perspective. I saw the power of perspective up close and personally a few years ago when I had the privilege of spending an afternoon with this young man, Nick Vujicic. How many of you have heard of this motivational speaker? I did a quick Google search as to whether you had a Talks at Google with Nick Vujicic, and I don't think you have, so I highly recommend it. This guy is hilarious. So it helps that he has an accent. He's from Australia. I just think accents are cool. And but he's really funny. So anyways, I know someone who knows Nick, and he was coming to the city I used to live in Canada, in Calgary. And so I thought, I got to try to meet this guy because I talk about his story so often. So sure enough, he was willing to meet with me and my colleagues. And we surprised my colleagues with him. They didn't know that he was coming, and they all knew his story. So when he came to the office, they were shocked. Like they were, like, no way, this isn't you. And then Nick looks at everyone. He goes, I'm not Nick Vujicic. I'm his stunt double. So anyways, Nick is a funny guy. He lives a full life. He loves traveling the world, speaking to millions of people and inspiring them, getting access to audiences I could only dream of getting access to. And it's because of what he doesn't have. It's because of his lack of limbs. He looks at this disability as an opportunity, but he didn't always have that attitude. He didn't always have that perspective. When Nick was a child, he was bullied and taunted and made fun of so much that one night, while lying in the family bathtub, he thought about rolling over and drowning himself in an act of suicide. Now, he obviously didn't do that. But what's also obvious is that his circumstances didn't change. He still lacks the limbs now that he lacked in that bathtub. So what's changed? His perspective. Instead of thinking about what his lack of limbs prevents him from doing, he started to think about what his lack of limbs enabled him to do. The afternoon I spent with him, I spent also with another family he had invited along. And that family included this 2-year-old girl, Brooke. And as you can see, Brooke doesn't have arms. Nick's lack of limbs was not diagnosed in utero by ultrasound. It was only discovered when he was born. Brooke's lack of limbs, or her lack of arms, on the other hand, was discovered while her mom was pregnant via ultrasound. And when the mom went for a routine ultrasound and they saw the fetus didn't have arms, the doctors offered to do an abortion. Brooke's parents said no. They didn't have a smartphone at the time, so they went home, and where do you think they went? Google. I've told this story so much, but I have to say I've never told it at Google, so I think that's really cool. So they went on to Google, and they typed "no arms, enter." And the first hit was Nick Vujicic. And they spent the rest of that pregnancy looking at videos of someone who was like their daughter. And then an opportunity came 2 years after she was born for them to drive 8 hours through the mountains from British Columbia to Alberta in Western Canada to see in the flesh someone who looked like their daughter. And when I saw Nick and Brooke interact, I thought he is uniquely positioned to motivate and inspire Brooke in a way her parents can't, in a way her sister can't, in a way none of us could. And it's because of what he doesn't have. His obstacle is now his opportunity. That's the power of perspective. I think that can be then obviously related to the abortion discussion. How can we change our perspective in an unplanned crisis situation? In another occasion where I was on a college campus, a student came to the microphone and said, "My stepmom had an abortion because she was told her fetus was going to die at birth." are you telling me she was wrong? And I first expressed sympathy to the student, saying that I was sorry for the suffering that his stepmom went through, and I don't pretend to know what that must have been like. And I said to him, your question is a fair one, and I'm going to answer it. But I said, if you'll bear with me, I believe I can best address your question by engaging you in a dialogue, by asking you some questions. Would that be okay? He said, sure. I said, okay, well, the question I have for you actually involves setting aside the abortion topic for just a moment and entering into a thought experiment. I said, I want you to imagine that someone you love dearly on the opposite end of the country calls you today and says, I've just been diagnosed with cancer and I've been given 4 weeks left to live. I looked at this student and I said, would you wait until week 3, day 6, to hop on a plane and go say goodbye to the person you love? Or, I said, would you take the next flight out and savor every moment of every day of the next 4 weeks with the person you love? And he said, well, the second option. I said, me too. And here's what I think this says about us. What I think it says about us is we recognize when we have a minimal amount of time left with someone we love, we want to maximize the minimal time. We don't want to cut short the already short time we have. That's perspective. So I said, let's take that principle, that perspective, and let's apply it to the situation your stepmom found herself in. Before that poor prenatal diagnosis, she probably thought she had 50 years with her child. And in one moment of hearing that news, your baby's going to die at birth, she went from having 50 years to roughly 20 weeks. I said, based on your analysis of the thought experiment, why would we cut short the already short time we have left? Instead, wouldn't we want to savor every moment of every day of the next 20 weeks with the child that we love? Now, upon the birth happening and the child dying, would there be sorrow, grief? Absolutely. But if you have the abortion and you wanted to be pregnant, would there be sorrow and grief? Yes. So having the abortion, instead of carrying on 20 more weeks, is not going to spare sadness, but it will rob you of the gift of time. And that's, again, where we want the power of perspective. The final point that I wanted to address this morning was that quality of inspiring people, which is to do the right thing even when it's hard. If you think about it, that fits with your code of conduct. I know you have a slogan here of don't be evil, and when Alphabet came to be, it got a little broader to do the right thing. But we know that we should do the right thing even when it's hard. And I think that's relevant in the abortion discussion if we think for a moment about the circumstances that a pregnant woman could be in. And if we think about the reasons that would prompt someone to have an abortion, we can acknowledge this is hard. Imagine being pregnant from rape, being in poverty, having health problems, just not wanting the child, or being really young, having no support. In each of these situations, wherever someone sits on the abortion debate, what side of the fence they're on, there's agreement. To be pregnant and poor would be hard. To be pregnant and young would be hard. To be pregnant from rape would be excruciatingly difficult. There's no denying the difficulty in these circumstances. The question is, what ought we do when circumstances are hard? Well, let's imagine the circumstances are these, but not with a pregnant person, but someone who's parenting this born child. Would it be easy or hard to take care of this child in poverty? Hard. Would it be easy or hard to care for this child and be 14? Hard. Would it be easy or hard to parent this child knowing every day you look in her face, you're reminded her father was a rapist? It would be hard. Would we ever allow someone to end this child's life because the circumstances for the parent are hard? We wouldn't. We would say we need to do the right thing even when it's hard. And so I would suggest in the various encounters I've had that we have the same attitude when it comes to this life. Since we know this is a living human being who, according to Article 6 of the UN, ought to be considered a person who's simply younger than the rest of us, And since human rights aren't grounded in age, they're grounded in being human, then we ought to say here as we say there, we have to do the right thing even when it's hard. And that brings to mind several people I've had the privilege of meeting who I believe by their stories have inspired me to do the right thing when it's hard in my own life the way they've done that in theirs. A few months ago, I spoke in Guatemala, and I spoke alongside another speaker, my friend here, Leanna. Leanna and I met for the first time in Guatemala. She speaks both Spanglish. She speaks English and Spanish. I, on the other hand, only speak English, and so I had a translator translate for the audience my talk. But because she spoke in Spanish, that meant when she gave her talk, I couldn't understand it. So it wasn't until we got to the restaurant after giving our first presentation in the hotel we were staying in that evening that we shared our stories and got to know each other. And as we were talking, she mentioned that she was 37. And I said, no way, I'm 36. And then a short while later, she mentioned that she had a daughter. And I said, well, how old is your daughter? And she said, 25. And then I did the math, and I thought, 25 years ago, I was 11, which means 25 years ago, Leanna was 12. And Leanna told me her story that growing up in Mexico City, when she was 12, one day, 2 men kidnapped her, held her for 2 days, and brutally raped her. She got pregnant from that rape. And when she went to the doctor and discovered this, the doctors offered her an abortion. And Leanna asked the doctors if abortion would help her forget the rape, if it would help ease her pain and suffering. And the doctor said, well, no, it won't do that. And she realized in that moment that if ending her baby's life wouldn't benefit anybody, she wasn't going to do it. And Leanna said, if abortion wasn't going to heal anything, I didn't see the point. She said, I just knew I had somebody inside my body. I never thought about who her biological father was. She was my kid. She was inside of me, and just knowing she needed me made me want to get a job to help her. But in an interview Leanna did, she shared that although that was her attitude about the pregnancy, the rape itself caused her life to become a living hell. No matter how many times she showered, she could not get rid of the feeling that she was dirty. And so she started to entertain thoughts, or she thought about committing suicide. But when she thought about committing suicide, she remembered she was pregnant, and she had to think not only about herself, but about the child. And so she didn't kill herself. And she looked at me in that restaurant in Guatemala, and she said to me, Stephany, I saved my daughter's life, but she saved mine. In another story of an inspiring person I've met who I believe brings this third principle to life, I'm reminded of a young woman by the name of Veronica who was a college student who got pregnant unexpectedly. And her boyfriend wanted her to have an abortion, and her friends wanted her to have an abortion. But she ended up telling her parents and moving back home and getting support. And she sent me this picture of her and her daughter, Amelia. And I'd like to read for you what she said to me when she sent this picture. She said, the picture I've enclosed of Amelia and I doesn't fully show my face, but it's an important picture to me. Amelia became very ill with respiratory problems around 7 months, which meant a lot of nights dealing with fever, congestion, pain control, and a sad little baby who kept waking up due to having trouble breathing in her sleep. She said, I took this picture one night when I decided to let her sleep on my chest instead of the crib. And she slept throughout the night. And so I did that every night until she was better. And she said to me, it represents what we do as mothers, that we stop looking at ourselves as individuals with needs. And instead, we begin to look at how we can serve another and therefore love another. And with doing that, she said, comes learning to love ourselves. And finally, I'm reminded of my friend Debbie. Debbie's story is similar to Leanna's and Veronica's in that she was unexpectedly pregnant. But unlike Leanna's and Veronica's story, Debbie had an abortion. And she deeply regrets having made that choice, but realizes, like all of us, she cannot undo her past. But she became convicted that if she had regrets, and she knew the impact of her choice back then that she lives with now, that she would have wanted someone to tell their story. And so she's decided to tell her story to try to help people think differently when it comes to the crisis they're in. And so she travels to different audiences, and she talks about her choice, and she talks about regretting it. And once she was in an audience where a student had a friend en route to an abortion clinic, and he simply sent his friend a text. There's a woman here who regrets her abortion. And the friend texted back, why? And so this young woman was willing to sit down with Debbie and listen to not only Debbie's story, but give Debbie an opportunity to listen to her and what her reasonings were for abortion. And she felt she had no support, that she couldn't get through that pregnancy and parenting. So Debbie said, I'll support you, and your friend here will support you. That girl didn't go to the abortion clinic that day, but she did go the next day to hear her child's heartbeat. And then she decided to carry through with that pregnancy. And several months later, this baby girl was born. And to wrap everything up before we move it into questions, I just want to leave you with the thought that whether it's this teenage mom who not only is delighted that she has this baby, but she encouraged another friend to carry through with the pregnancy that friend is grateful to have. Whether it's this teenage mom, or whether it's Debbie, or whether it's Leanna, or Veronica, whether it's little Brooke or her parents, whether it's Captain Sullenberger, who prioritized the passengers on his airplane, whether it's Nick Vujicic, that you remember all these people and think, you know, they're inspiring because they put others ahead of themselves, because they had perspective, and because they did the right thing, even when it was really hard. And that's the challenge that I leave all of you with today. Thank you very much. At this point, I would be happy to engage you in a dialogue, a conversation, and a question and answer period. So if you have questions about the topic in general or anything I've shared, I would be happy to answer them. And Mark has a microphone over there, and he will take it around. So any questions?
And I was wondering, how do you suggest creating a dialogue like this in an environment which is almost entirely for abortion? So how do you even start this conversation when you know there is such a strong outward resistance to a pro-life point of view?
You know, hopefully it came through in the stories that I shared that I think a lot of the times the way we start conversations, whether we think it's an environment that's going to be friendly or not so friendly, is to start conversations with open-ended questions. So I will ask people, what do you think about abortion? And if that might seem like a really random, not so much lunch table conversation, you could maybe find an article in the newspaper or something that you read about online that somehow relates and bring it up and say, did you see that article about X, Y, or Z? And it made me think, what do you think about this topic? What do you think about abortion? And really seek to understand where that person is coming from. And to give you an example, once on an airplane, a guy sitting next to me, we shared what our jobs were, and he asked what I did, and I said, I go and give talks about abortion. And he said, really? That's fascinating. And I just looked at him and said, what do you think about abortion? And he said, I think it's necessary sometimes. And I just asked another question. I said, when do you think it's necessary? And he said, like cases of rape. And I said, you know, I agree with you that rape is a horrible evil. And we need to not only support the woman who's been victimized, but we need far more serious consequences for the rapist. And then I said to him, I have to ask myself a question, though. And the question I have to ask myself is this: is it fair to give the death penalty to the innocent child? And this passenger looked at me and he said, well, I never thought of it that way. And so I didn't go in boarding my plane with the intention to, speak about abortion. I just asked a few questions when someone asked me what my job was. Any other questions?
Hi, so I have a friend who says he's pro-life. Like if he were with a woman who's pregnant, he would really do everything in his power to persuade her to choose life. But he says he wouldn't want to impose that decision on someone else. What is your...
So that's a common perspective people have, is I feel this way, and I might even encourage you, but I can't force my views on you insofar as I don't think the law, for example, should reflect how I would live. And when someone says that, I think analogies are helpful. I would ask a question and draw an analogy out of it. I would say, well, would you say that you're against rape? Yes. And if someone was going to commit rape, would you try to stop them? Yes. And do you think if you're incapable of stopping them and they actually commit rape, that we ought to have laws that ban rape so there are consequences for that person? And if they say yes, then I would say, okay, so you clearly think under some circumstances we should have laws that say certain actions are wrong. So then why, when it comes to abortion, would you treat it differently if abortion ends the life of a human being? Now, if abortion doesn't end the life of a human being, then I think we can call into question, should we have any laws against it? But since we know we're dealing with a human being that's living, then if the act of abortion ends that human being's life, it's not enough for me to say, I personally won't kill someone, but if you want to kill someone, that's your right. If the facts are true, if the evidence is there, we have to go to its logical conclusion and say, if this action ends someone's life, it's wrong not just for me, but it's wrong for everyone. And we ought to have laws against it, as we do with rape and other types of murder and other things like that. So we can't determine whether we should, quote unquote, force our views on other people until we know what the view is. Like, for example, a lot of times people say, I support a woman's right to choose. We have to finish our sentence. That's not grammatically correct. Choose what? It's hanging there. I support a woman's right to choose what color shoes to wear with her outfit? Sure. What kind of ice cream she thinks is the best? Sure. But I don't support a woman's right to choose to kill an innocent child, regardless of the child's age. So in a similar way, if I said to you, I support a man's right to take, you would have to ask me to define what I mean. Take what? And if it's a support a man's right to take his bag and walk out of the room, totally okay. But I don't support a man's right to take someone else's bag out of the room. So we need to define what we mean by choice, by take, by all of this stuff. And if in defining it, evidence leads us to the fact that we're actually ending someone's life or violating a human right, then we have to create a structure legally that bans that for the interests of our fellow human beings. Any other questions?
I haven't really quite formulated my question. On top of using that same analogy, then, what good kind of would incarcerating a mother be? When we're talking about the issue being that women do not have enough support right now. So what good would making it illegal do for the woman, and showing her that there is support for her, that there is like another way?
Very good question. So certainly I would say it's not just one strategy and abandoning all other strategies. The slogan I like to use is make abortion unthinkable. But in believing it ought to be unthinkable based on the evidence of dealing with a human being and believing in human rights, believing it ought to be unthinkable doesn't exclude me from saying I also believe it ought to be illegal. I do believe it ought to be illegal and unthinkable. What would be the consequences for a woman who violates the law? Well, the first point is no woman is currently violating the law. So we're not talking about, for example, putting women in jail who have had abortions. What we're talking about is a hypothetical at some future point when the law changes, what ought the consequences be? And even when we say something is illegal, it's illegal to steal, what the consequences are for any individual who steals vary from case to case. You might find a situation where a woman has an abortion under emotional duress. She is not freely choosing it. It's against the law, but someone's pressuring her or forcing her to go there against her will. So that would be one example. Or you have cases like Andrea Yates, where you have a woman who drowned her born children in the bathtub. And I believe in her case she was found not criminally responsible. Her actions were still wrong and they're still unlawful, but a case was made or could be made in circumstances like this where someone was not of the right frame of mind to be fully consenting to the action that they were taking. So all of that needs to be taken into account. But the reality is the law currently isn't against abortion. And so what I think is very important, as efforts are made to have the law changed to reflect human rights, that all of us have the inalienable right to life, In the meantime, we have to offer support to women, absolutely. And there are pregnancy centers, there are homes for pregnant women, there are nonprofits across the country that exist to do that very thing, and to not only journey with a woman through her pregnancy, but to really walk with her after her pregnancy as well. If she chooses to parent rather than adoption, she's going to need a lot of support, and these centers exist, and I would say very much should have our attention and support. So I hope that was helpful. Any final questions?
Well, you're giving an inspiring talk, so you're kind of like that good person quality that you're kind of mentioning. So I was going to ask a personal question: what inspires you to be who you are to give talks around the world?
Oh, well, thank you. In terms of what inspires me, you know, just speaking of pregnancy centers there, my mom volunteered at a pregnancy center when I was a young child. Both my parents were really active in the pro-life cause, you could say, generally speaking. But in particular, my mom volunteered at a pregnancy center. So when clients would come for pregnancy tests, I would often go with her, and I would doodle on letterhead while she was in the office counseling the girls. And when those clients gave birth, my mom would go to the hospital with flowers, and I would come along. And so from a very young age, I saw that there were women in crisis who felt they had no support. And I saw that there were people like my parents and my mom who would support them and love them through that difficult circumstance and turn that obstacle they were in into an opportunity. And that laid the foundation to really convict me to want to use the skills that I had to help those who were more vulnerable and in need. And I went to university actually with plans to pursue a different career, but I heard an American speaker who came to Canada, and I was a college student. His name is Scott Klusendorf, and he gave a presentation on this topic that blew my mind. And in that talk, he said there are more people working full-time to kill babies than there are working full-time to save them. And I'll admit, when I heard those words, I became very convicted that I wanted to be one of the people being a voice for those who were entirely incapable of raising their voices against what was happening to them. And a lot of things unfolded, and here I am 15 years later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gray. If you guys have any remaining unasked questions, she'll be here. You can talk to her in person. And again, we have copies of her book, Love Unleashes Life. So thank you very much for coming, and for those tuning in as well, too. Thank you.